the cast of Seinfeld got transported from New York and plunked down in the jungle, how would they survive? So the setup was very, clear and funny. A bunch of New York animals who only know being pampered in zoo life, and then transposed. Conrad came up with the gingerbread man for Shrek, and
One of my
that was,
favorite characters.
yeah, it was a little throwaway to show. I think the whole point of that was basically to establish how evil Lord Farquaad was.
Going back to Tortoise and Hare, so you said earlier that DreamWorks knew that it was gonna fall apart.
It was in production. They had sets built, and they were. I mean, I saw animation. Saw shot animation that had been done that probably shouldn't have been done because the story was nowhere near good, good enough to go into production. So they had.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Kingdom of Dreams podcast, The Making of Stories. I'm your host, Jawad Mir. Today, my guest is John Stevenson, who I had the pleasure of having a couple of times on this podcast, once for Kung Fu Panda, which he co-directed, and Labyrinth and Dark Crystal, on which he worked on back in the 80s. Today, he's here to talk about Madagascar as a storyboard artist, some incredible stories from the film, behind the scenes stories, as well as the abandoned project Tortoise and Hare by Aardman and DreamWorks Animation. He gets a little bit into that and a whole lot of other fun stuff. So without further ado, here's my conversation with storyboard artist, animator, director, John Stevenson. I'm really excited because I've been looking forward to chatting with you again. We spoke obviously about Kung Fu Panda, we spoke about Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, and now we're going to talk about Madagascar. So let's just start with what was your official role on the film.
I, I was a story artist, and I'm credited as such on the film. It's a while now, so I'm trying to remember the exact sequence of events. I sort of joined DreamWorks in the late 90s, either like 97 or 98. I can't remember
Mm-hmm.
exactly when. Um, and I was hired as to be the head of story on a film called Tusker, which ended up never happening.
Right, right.
Um, but while Tusker was getting ready, I was assigned to Shrek, the first one. So I was a story artist on Shrek, and I'm credited on that. And I got a couple of scenes in the movie. And then I think after Shrek, as was very common at DreamWorks at the time, if you were just sort of while you were in the hiatus between your next official gig, you were just sort of available to help out on other productions. So I'm
Yeah.
not quite sure of the sequence of events. I know I did a little stint on Spirit, Stallion of the Cimarron on a sequence. I know I worked on Sinbad, um, uh, Legend of the Seven Seas, and worked on the introduction of Eris. And somewhere in there, I think I started on Madagascar, and then I think I was sent to Aardman, who were making a film called Tortoise and Hare, which was in trouble. And I think this is my memory, that I had begun on Madagascar, that I was pulled off Madagascar to sort of do a 911, emergency post to be sent to Bristol in the UK because the film was in trouble. I think I'm trying to think who the other there was some other DreamWorks folks there. I know Steve Hickman was there. Um, Maybe David Soren was there. I'm trying to remember exactly who. It was like four guys from DreamWorks, working at Aardman. And that film was in trouble, and it very obviously in bad trouble when I got there, and and it got cancelled while I was there. So I was sent to sort of try and help, rescue it, but it became pretty apparent that it was beyond rescuing, and we knew before the DreamWorks people knew before the Aardman people did that the film was going to get shut down, and so that was a very uncomfortable day when there was this big announcement to the whole of Aardman that we knew exactly what it was, but they did not. And I remember that very clearly. But so then the film was shut down. Everybody was laid off. It was a big, disaster for Aardman. But then I was over in the UK in Bristol, with my wife and my new baby, and I didn't have a film to work on. So what I remember is working on Madagascar again in my little flat in Bristol, sitting on the floor drawing storyboards, with Carol and Faith until pretty much the end of my assigned time in the UK. So I spent more time, in fact, on Madagascar in the UK than I did on the film that I'd been sent to the UK to work on, because it got shut down after I don't know, a month or something like that after I was there. Then I had another few months of being in the UK, and then I came back and continued. I think this is right, but I will caveat with as the older I get, the more clearly I remember things that never happened. So as Mark Twain said. So allowing to remember that. But I think I came back and went back into Madagascar full time as a story artist, and then at some point I was fired, and I went on to Shrek 2, and the exact sequencing of that I'm not entirely sure of.
It's okay.
I think it's that. It might be. I believe I'd started on Madagascar, went to the UK, worked on Madagascar in the UK, came back and worked on Madagascar. It's possible that I started in Madagascar in the UK and then did some more when I came back to the US. Not quite sure, but I definitely. I remember the things I remember. Spending a long time. We spent, everybody in story spent a long time working on Act One, reworking Act One, reworking Act One over and over again, and that was fine. The setup was very clear. It was basically, the idea. I think the basic idea was like if the cast of Seinfeld got transported from New York and plunked down in the jungle, how would they survive? So the setup was very, clear and funny. To a bunch of New York animals who only know being pampered in zoo life and then transposed to the jungle. That was clear. The thing that was not clear to me, which got me fired, was what happened in Act 3. It was like, okay, that's the setup, but what's the payoff? And I after working and reworking Act 1. I am going to own the fact that I could be a pushy and cranky little prick. So I am sure I did not handle this in a very diplomatic or as politic way as it could have been handled, and I probably shouldn't have done it anyway. So now I think back on it, the firing was probably completely justified. But I was very frustrated trying to set things up that I didn't know what the payoff was. And we kept changing, redoing scenes. But I was like, but where are we going? If I knew where we were going, I'd have a better idea of how to set it up.
Sure.
At the beginning. And I think at some point I got so frustrated with not knowing where everybody was going to land in the third act, so I didn't know how to try and help set them up in their introductory scenes in Act 1, that I made some big chart like if this happens in Act 1 and blah blah blah, then it could be option A and blah 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 option and I think I marched that in to Murray Soria, who was the producer's office, and kind of said, which one of these do you want? Some version of that, which did not go down well at all. And then I said, Murray didn't say much. I went back to my office, and I think about 15 minutes later, somebody came in and said, "You're now going to be working on Shrek 2. So I'm just going to take these drawings and thank you and so I sat there for a few minutes, and I walked down the corridor to Eric Darnell, who's one of the director's offices, and I said, Eric, did I just get fired? And he said, yep. So, I was like, okay, just wanted to know. Thanks. So that that was sort of how Madagascar ended for me, and I should have done that. That was definitely overstepping, and that was definitely not the right way to go about things. And I think Murray was probably right to show me the door. But I did, I went, actually perhaps informed by that experience when I'm working on something and people say, where should we start? I always say at the end. Let's start at the end. Let's have an idea where we're going.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And we can always change on the way if we find a better thing, but I don't want to start off on the journey without knowing what the destination is, because then I could go, if you have some idea of, if we end here, this will be satisfying, then you can sort of have a better idea of, okay, well, if that's where we want to go, if it's a story about, redemption or whatever it is, then clearly the character has to be in this place at the beginning in order to complete that arc. So I like to feel secure that I know where a story is going to end in a way that I think will be satisfying, and then that makes setting up the opening easier, at least for me.
Sure.
So yeah, on Madagascar, I know I worked like everybody on the story department. We all worked and reworked, setting up the characters in the zoo, and all those kind of just trying to establish their individual personalities. I think the only thing of mine that I can point to that I got in the movie, very often, on any animated feature, you have a lot of people working on the same material. Somebody will start the scene and then it'll be revised by other people. So it comes, obviously it's a collaboration and a group effort, and it's hard to say, exactly, who did what. Sometimes it's very clear, sometimes, somebody like Conrad Vernon or Mike Mitchell, Chris Miller will have a standout scene that just basically goes into the movie, with minimal changes, and you can absolutely go, well, that's a Chris scene, that's a Conrad scene, that's a Mike scene. But most scenes are sort of a bit of Chris, a bit of Conrad, a bit of this, sort of a kind of a melange of things. I think the idea that I got in was in trying to set up Marty and Alex's relationship. I remembered, the lion tamer putting, the head in the mouth of the lion to show their control over a lion and the trust that they had in that. And I think I got the idea that Marty puts his head in Alex's mouth to sort of look at something caught in his teeth, and that would show how much Marty trusted Alex not to eat him, because Alex is, even though he is a carnivore, he's not aware that Marty will prey. So I think that scene is, I haven't seen Madagascar in years, and I think that got into the film. Other than that, I worked on later in the movie when Alex is really hungry, and Marty comes to him when the herbivores are all doing fine and Alex is doing badly because he doesn't understand where meat comes from. And I remember that scene. I remember doing a bunch of stuff on the Foosas chasing Marty and Alex, various explorations of that. I sort of, a couple of years ago, I realized I had all these boxes of storyboards and art I've been carrying around the world forever, and I just decided to get rid of it all. So all the storyboards I did for Madagascar, I remember sending back to, which I still had, and any DreamWorks project storyboards I still had, I sent back to DreamWorks. It was like they came
Oh,
and
that's nice of you.
picked up, and then I had a bunch of stuff I did for the Muppet Show, and Dark Crystal and Labyrinth and things, and I sent that to
Yeah.
Henson, and I just kind of cleaned house of that stuff. So I don't have any DreamWorks, boards anymore.
Yeah.
The DreamWorks archive. But as I went through it, I remember scenes of Marty and Alex being chased by the Fooses through canyons. I did some kind of thing where there was a crashed airplane in part of the chase, and
Yes.
they got into the airplane, and the airplane broke into two bits, and it was rolling down the hill and stuff. So I remember those were boards that I sent back to DreamWorks. I remember stuff I did of a starving Alex sitting on a log in a clearing, and Marty coming up and trying to having a conversation. And a lot of stuff in the New York Zoo of Marty and Alex talking, and Alex getting steak and all that kind of stuff. But the only bit I think was where the only bit I can really go, well, that I think was my idea. That was just that moment of Marty putting his head in Alex's mouth. Everything else is just a contribution to
Sure.
the work of a lot of people. A lot of people from that crew ended up working on Kung Fu Panda, like Jed Diffenderfer and Rodolphe Gwendon and Alfred Cameno, Alessandro Carloni. They were all, went on to work on Kung Fu Panda later. Claire Knight, Claire Deschanel, as she was then, was our editor on Kung Fu Panda, editor on Madagascar. Jen Nelson worked on it, became a head of story on Kung Fu Panda, and Catherine Ureda, who's a sister who I worked with at PDI in Palo Alto. I think she was the head of story, or certainly one of the primary story artists on Madagascar, because that was that was mostly a PDI project. Kendall Cronkite was the production designer, so that it was mostly sort of initiated at PDI. So I must have looked at it at PDI for a bit, because I didn't move down to work at the Glendale facility full time until 2003. So this, I'm not exactly
That's
when
fine.
this stuff happens has got a little bit kind of mushy.
That's understandable. And I think, I mean, in all that you mentioned, a lot of things to unpack, but let me just start off with, I'm glad you mentioned the tortoise and the hare, because I remember when I used to run the website, I remember reading the press release about that and how it got canceled, because I think it was after Chicken Run and before Wallace and Gromit, Curse of the Were Rabbit, right? So thank you for bringing that up. Tusker, I remember seeing storyboards of Tusker in the late 90s or the early 2000s that were released. I think there was like one, not a storyboard, like a concept art, essentially. A herd of elephants just sort of walking, kind of reminded me of Jungle Book. And Madagascar, of course, I didn't realize, I mean, I know the concept of it came from Jeffrey Katzenberg from his childhood experiences at Central Zoo and how that sort of derived into the story. But I never put the Seinfeld connection with that. I mean, it makes perfect sense now because I mean there was like three male, one female, and it's similar kind of chemistry.
Yeah, that was the shorthand. I when I was put on it, I remember that was the shorthand that people were saying. To understand what this is, it's like imagine the cast of Seinfeld, and then dump them in the jungle, and how would they get on? They would be ill-equipped for life in the jungle, and they would bring all their neuroses and sort of weird interpersonal relationships with them, but they wouldn't be very good at getting food or making shelter or any of that stuff. So that it was a very efficient way of kind of targeting. Okay, that's sort of the tone and the kind of the comedy of the piece. So I didn't come up with that. That's just me reiterating what I remember people saying at the time when I started working.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons, so I remember when Madagascar came out, um, obviously it was a huge success. It generated two sequels and also spin-offs. But to me, and I'm sure you would agree, nothing to take away from the main story, but one of the reasons it succeeded was because of the Penguins and King Julian, like Sacha Cohen Brown. Like it just kind of made these memorable characters. And Penguins had their own film, I think, if my memory serves me right, which were voiced by some of the one of the directors and producers, I think, right? Eric Darnell was one of the voices
Tom,
behind it.
Tom McGrath,
Tom McGrath.
he's the captain.
Yeah.
That was Tom's, definitely Tom's idea. The Penguins. That was, and very often it happens that like people like Tom McGrath and Mike Mitchell and Conrad, they will come up with an idea which is maybe at first a throwaway that becomes kind of the linchpin, for Conrad came up with the Gingerbread Man for Shrek, and
one of my favorite characters.
Yeah, it was a little throwaway to show. I think the whole point of that was basically to establish how evil Lord Farquaad was, and so he was just there torturing the Gingerbread Man, and then the Gingerbread Man, was just such a funny, character, that he became, took on a much bigger life, and got put into more scenes, expanded roles in sequels and what have you. But originally it was sort of a throwaway, and I think the Penguins kind of started out. They were a funny idea that Tom came up with that ended up being so funny that people just wanted more and more of them. That often happens, that something which is originally just designed as a small moment, unexpectedly, takes on a much larger role, and it's kind of part of the process when you're in story on an animated film, but of decide, you find out a lot of the things that you thought were going to be, the things you thought would be the winners turn out to be, that isn't the gold. And then things that you didn't really think much of, like a side character like the Gingerbread Man or the Penguins, that turns out to be where the audience puts their love, and so you have to recalibrate the story, which is okay. They want less of that, more of that, or they don't know that. That's what your job is in story creation. You realize, okay, these scenes are working great, and these scenes are not working so well. Clearly there's stuff going on here that isn't going on there. We should, it's like making a complex stew. You're trying to figure out, how much thyme, how much oregano, how much basil. You might think, oh, this stew it needs a lot of basil, and then you start tasting it and you go, you know what? That's way too much basil. I want a bit more oregano, and then you sort of rebalance until you hopefully find something that works. Clearly, they did on Madagascar. Massively successful. First film and multiple sequels, and I was probably the thing that I was, had me going, the sort of frustration that had me going into Ray's office and getting fired. I was probably wrong about. I mean, I was certainly wrong about the way I approached it. That was definitely, me being impetuous and undisciplined. But I kept feeling that there was a sort of a Chekhovian gun that was placed on the table in Act 1 that was not being fired in Act 2, which is quite a dark gun. And they didn't want to, I don't think that was a place they wanted to go. And I thought the film needed to go there. But I was clearly not right, because people loved the film the way it was.
Yeah.
And you don't have a hit that big and sequels if people don't really respond to the material. So I think the thing that the bee in my bonnet that made me sort of want to get to grips with Act 3, I was probably wrong about. So.
That's fine. But Madagascar, one of the things I'll say something about Madagascar, but I want to go back to Tortoise and Hare if you don't mind. I love the animation from Madagascar. So because it was a comedy, obviously a lot of animations are, but this had like a Seinfeld feel to it, as we talked about. it didn't feel like computer animation, but it didn't feel like hand drawn. So it was like a very perfect cross between the two, and that made the story and the characters stand out as opposed to, you know, going, oh my God, look at that animation like Lion King or Prince of Egypt and stuff. So it stayed grounded, and I think one of the reasons it worked was also that visual um, uniqueness to it.
Mhm. Well, yeah, I think there was a conscious decision for Madagascar to be allowed to be cartoony in a
Yeah,
way.
that's the right word.
Cartoony was a word you know you didn't use at DreamWorks at the time. Um, Cartoony was sort of considered sort of you know slightly bad, like a slightly dirty word to say cartoon. We're not making cartoons. We're making animated films or whatever. You know, but there was a conscious choice in the character designs. Craig Kelborn did the designs. They're very pushed and exaggerated and simple with great graphic lines. Yeah, and then Kendall Cronkite, who was a production designer, came up with this kind of sort of Russo-esque, inspired art direction. And I think it was definitely, they were definitely going for something different to Shrek, which sort of has a slightly more kind of, even though
Yeah,
the fairy tale creatures, but it's sort of a slightly more
yeah,
realistic lighting approach and stuff. And this I think was unapologetically, cartoony, and
yeah.
um, and benefited from that. I think they were experimenting with squashy, stretchy, snappy kind of cartoon Warner Brothers esque animation that was absolutely not appropriate for Shrek. Shrek was much more physics based, there's definitely more sort of squash and stretch and Tex Avery esque stuff in Madagascar, and all of that was very conscious, as I remember. But there was
Yeah.
a way of distinguishing Madagascar from Shrek and trying something different with CG, which was still pretty new. There had only been a handful of CG films, so we were still trying to figure out what it could and couldn't do well.
Yeah. No, that's well said because, yeah, I think Madagascar really changed a lot of things, not in terms of obviously storytelling of animation, but also the way the animations were done because there was that rise of 3D, which still is there,
Mhm.
right? But I think Madagascar kind of became a little speed bump in the way of the 3D world, which is still there. I mean, but now Spider-Verse and other type of films that are coming out, they're changing that feel and look too. Going back to Tortoise and Hare, so you said earlier that DreamWorks knew that it was going to fall apart, but people at Aardman did not. So what stage was it at in the entire process that they realized it wasn't going to work, and why did they realize? Was it the story? Was it the budget?
Well, I can't speak to budget, and I was literally sort of. I remember Steve Lippman or uses somebody telling me that I was going to be assigned, taken off what I was doing,
Yeah.
whether that was Madagascar or Sinbad or Spirit, whatever it was, and get sent to the UK. And I think one of the reasons that they thought I might help was because even though I was living in America and had been for a while, I obviously came from England, and I think there was definitely a them and us kind of thing
Of
happening.
course.
Aardman, Aardman had always been its own kind of self-contained little world, and then it had done this deal with DreamWorks for three pictures, and the second one had been very successful. Um, but I think there was this sort of resentment of the Americans, being in their world and coming in with their way of doing things versus the Aardman way of doing things. And so there was some lack of communication going on there. And apart from whatever I might have been able to contribute to helping the story, I think they possibly thought, well, maybe John's got a foot in both worlds. He comes from the UK. He understands the English,
Mm.
but not just an English sense of humor, but maybe a sort of a lower register passive aggression from England, and he said, I mean, I certainly understood the DreamWorks way of doing things, which was, Jeffrey wanted the most direct path, the shortest distance between A and B, and never mind anybody's feelings. Really, you just needed to get good fast, and maybe that kind of DreamWorks approach was kind of running into a slightly more, I don't know, laissez-faire, gentle, English approach, and the two things were not working. Anyway, I don't know. Nobody ever explained it to me. I was just told, you're going to England next week to, all right, there you go. It was in production. They had sets built, and I saw animation. I saw shot animation that had been done that probably shouldn't have been done because the story was nowhere near good enough to go into production. So they had, I'm just sort of parachuting into a mess and trying to up on, how has it got here and whatever. I couldn't understand why they'd already jumped into building sets and animating scenes when the story was still clearly not working, and that was an expense that seemed to be premature, and the scenes I remember were beautifully animated, but I didn't understand. It was like, how is this going to fit in the film? Like it was very languid. I remember there was one scene. It was like a long tour of Tortoise's room. The Tortoise was voiced, I think, by Michael Caine.
That's cool.
Yeah, but it was just like, just the shot went on forever. It was beautifully done. The guy looking at his room and coming to him in the bed sleeping. And I was just like, why? Why do that? It was nice, but it was like, do you need that shot? Do you need it to be that long? What is this shot doing? There was a lot of that kind of stuff. It felt like there was an assumption that it was all going to work out. And they would just build things the way they always had and make the film. And DreamWorks folks are much more used to sort of being, the meat grinder of story and working and reworking and kicking the tires and having your ideas torn apart and rebuilt and to try and get to the best possible version of a scene. And you didn't go into production until you had something as robust as possible. This was another that Tusker never happened. Even though there were many really good things about Tusker, the story was not ready to go into the production by the time it needed to, and that was the call Jeffrey made was to stop it before it did, because once you jump from pre-production, which is a fairly small team, 30, 50 people, to full production, which is hundreds of people, now you're really burning money. If you haven't got your ducks in a row, and you suddenly realize you've got to do a massive rewrite or something in the middle of that, cutting that down is really expensive. And on Tusker, I think that it was incredibly painful. I've been working my ass off on that thing for, I don't know how long, 18 months, something like that. So that really hurt when that was shut down. But coming into Tortoise and the Hare, I thought, yeah, this is trouble. And then it was kind of like a race against the clock. It was like, and can we find a way of making this better for the Hammer Falls? And we could not. You know, so we
Yeah.
we knew. I don't think any of us knew that they were going to cancel it. I think we knew that there was a very good chance that it was going to be, you know, put on pause until it could
Yeah.
be made better. And we knew that would be incredibly difficult for people in Bristol. It's not like if you work at Aardman and you're a puppet builder or a costume maker or a prop maker, it's not really like there's an awful lot of other studios who do that kind of thing in the UK, never mind in Bristol. We knew that would be painful, but I don't think any of us actually thought one would be completely cancelled. That was still a very unusual step to take at that time for a film that had clearly had a lot of investment already made in it. But yeah, I remember Cecil Kramer, who's one of the DreamWorks producers, pulling the DreamWorks people into a secret meeting and warning us it's like tomorrow they're going to tell Aardman that they're closing the film down. So we
Yeah.
knew, and we had to go in to that meeting without letting anybody know that we knew what that meeting was going to be. It was an awful, awful meeting. I don't think that had ever happened to Aardman at all. So I think they thought it was going to be good news. So everybody's coming into the commissary and it's all sort of jolly banter, and we're sitting at the back, like waiting for the horrible thing to happen, and knowing that all these people are going to be out of work. It was awful, really. I think of it now, and my insides still kind of clench up. Really, really unpleasant situation.
Yeah. And I think, it's a shame that we didn't get to see it because claymation of Tortoise and Hare, the slow movement versus fast, and obviously the story itself would have been really, really cool to see. But I also think I have no way of providing any evidence behind this, but I'm guessing aside from the fact of the story, because around that time, Sinbad had come out. And one of the reasons DreamWorks, at least that's according to the reports, started falling apart from a standpoint of money was because of failure of Sinbad.
Yeah,
It literally tanked. And it had a big impact on their stock market, I think their IPO. But I think if that movie was around in pre-production around that same time, I'm wondering if Sinbad had been successful if that had been not canceled. You know what I mean? Like I'm wondering if there's that factor too, because DreamWorks was struggling in the 2002s and threes or fours.
I can't. I honestly can't say. All I can say is I think there was enough story in the Tortoise and the Hare story that I saw for a nice half-hour special.
Mm,
Story there for an 80-minute feature. And it sort of felt like it was being kind of, what story there was being kind of
dragged out.
spread out. And
Yeah.
it felt like, at the time, the kind of the time frame that Aardman was probably most comfortable was that half-hour special. They'd done The Wrong Trousers, which packs, a huge amount of story into a fantastic half hour, and and Tortoise and the Hare might have been a good half-hour special. They didn't seem to have enough going on to, there wasn't enough new things to make it. It was, as far as I remember, it was basically a version of the Tortoise and the Hare story with sort of slightly modernized attitudes. But that was,
Mm,
nothing. I don't remember anything that you hadn't expected to see happening, really. And I just, I think that was the reason. There just wasn't enough story there to justify 80 minutes, and whatever development had happened prior to my arrival, it was only confirming that to DreamWorks, which is it's not a movie. There's no movie here. And we weren't able there was definitely I felt resistance, from Aardman to, and we were trying to help. I mean, my memory is that we knew because we were intimately, you know, had intimate knowledge of how it was working directly with Jeffrey and his lack of patience in things getting good in a timely fashion. And there was this sort of slightly lackadaisical attitude, and it's like, you guys are in trouble. You need to step it up. If you don't, something bad's happen, and they didn't. My memory is they didn't take the note.
Yeah.
Take it seriously in our efforts to try and convince them to, work harder and push harder to try and resolve this stuff. And, it didn't come as a surprise, but it was still kind of shocking when we heard they're going to pull the plug.
It's. I remember, and this is just me making a comment. You don't need to say anything about that because I remember when Chicken Run came out. Around that time, PDI was PDI DreamWorks, and then it became part of DreamWorks. And I remember reading once, wait, this is long ago, so this could be just pure speculation, that there was some sort of, not necessarily clash, but like a little bit of a reluctancy wall between Aardman and Jeffrey, especially even after the success of Chicken Run, because there was speculation that I think DreamWorks wanted to sort of completely absorb Aardman, and Aardman wanted to be completely, obviously, independent, which I think in the long grand scheme of things worked out better because Aardman is still around, and DreamWorks, even though it's still around, but it's part of like Universal now. I mean, it's gone through so many different ways. But that's something I read too. I remember.
Yeah, you're right. Aardman had always been fiercely independent. They'd grown themselves. It was a weird thing. Like in order for them to get bigger, they needed more money than the BBC or their normal sort of
Yeah.
the whatever the UK could provide in terms of financial support. Was not enough. It was enough to do a half-hour special
Yeah.
for the BBC, like The Wrong Crowd, but to get the money to do a theatrical feature, you needed different source of money, and DreamWorks could do that, but you don't get free money. If you're taking someone's money, you get their requirements because it is a business. If someone's investing, millions and millions of dollars, they want a say in how that millions of dollars is going to
Be spent.
And I think there was a thing of, like, well, we don't need you to tell us how to spend the money. We know we know how to do this stuff. We're Aardman, and we've done things, which was true, but they hadn't done features until Chicken Run.
Well, Chicken Run, I wouldn't even count. Sorry to interrupt you, because that was like a great escape. They just took that and they just kind of transferred it into like the whole chicken scenario, right? But obviously a little bit of changes and stuff.
It's still, yes, I mean, it's exactly the Great Escape with chickens, but it is still the first time Aardman makes an 18-minute feature, and it has slightly different tone to there's definitely got American casting and certain American isms, which are sort of, I'm sure, by DreamWorks to make it, not too parochial, so it would appeal to an American in the world. And they're absolutely, when I got to Aardman, I definitely felt there was a sort of resistance to Americans at DreamWorks telling Aardman how to do something, and we understood, as the people in story department who were from DreamWorks. There was some English storyboard artists too, but we understood the company whose money they were spending.
Yeah.
What DreamWorks was like and what they wanted and what they needed, and the DreamWorks work ethic. And it was a very different work ethic to the Aardman work ethic. Clearly, you were used to being sort of kicked in the pants until it got good at DreamWorks, and no excuses. And there was a little bit more of just, we'll just figure it out in our own time at Aardman. And we knew that was going to rub, or obviously was rubbing up the wrong way. He has very low patience for things not getting good fast. He expects you to make things good fast, and that's the DreamWorks way. That's not necessarily the Aardman way. And there was definitely a kind of a culture clash. But we knew the consequences of making Jeffrey unhappy, and they were severe. And I don't think Aardman did know the consequences. I don't think they realized if they had a 3-picture deal that didn't mean if Jeffrey wasn't happy with your picture, that picture couldn't go away. I don't think they had got that, and then it landed like an anvil.
Sure. Yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. No, this has been terrific. So when we talked about Madagascar, we talked about Tortoise versus Hare. Let's talk briefly as we wrap it up. What are you up to now, if that's something that you're willing to discuss or talk about? Just what's keeping you busy.
I'm working on I have a project I developed during COVID for an adult drama to be told in animation based on a true event from the First World War. And we have easy for me to say, but bizarrely, this is true. It's actually the best script I've ever read in like 50 years of reading scripts. Matt Harvey, the guy who wrote the script for us, delivered the first draft that just made me go, just film that. That's it. That's great. We have a great script, and what we're doing now, I asked my friend Neil Boyle, who did the 2D animation on Sherlock Gnomes, and we became friends on that. I asked him to be, co-director with me on this. So we called in favors from, old school hand-drawn animator chums, and we're 1 minute proof of concept teaser how this could work. So we will have the script, but then we'll also have a minute of full finished animation, so no one can say, I don't know what it's going to look like. It's going to look like that. So that's we've been working on that for a while. It's all voluntary and when time permits, but I'm hoping we'll have that done by the end of the year. There's that, and then there's the usual crop of Hollywood projects that may or may not ever.
Right. So what's the log line for this project, if that's something that's possible to be shared?
That's actually a good question. I don't know that we've got a good log. We have a good script. I don't know that we've got a good log line. So that's something to work on.
Or just a synopsis, just like a couple of sentences, just to get an idea what it's about.
It's about a secret deep sea diving unit of the Royal Navy in the First World War that would dive onto wrecked German U-boats and recover logbooks and secret codes so that they would know where the Germans were going to deploy their submarine fleet and lay their mine. And the Germans never knew how they were getting this information because it was so insanely dangerous. This is like 1914, so it's old-timey diving suits. It's not scuba. It's sort of brass helmets and lead weights and diving in pitch black and cutting your way into submarines full of corpses. It's called the Tin Openers, and that was their nickname. They were called the Special Division of the Royal Navy, but their nickname was the Tin Openers. And most of it has been kept secret and a long time. It's all covered by the National all the official secrets act. But I started researching it during COVID, and yeah, I'd love to see that made. And originally I was thinking it was a live action film, and then my wife said, well, why don't you do it in animation? And it was like, oh. And it actually allows the nightmarish quality of, being underwater in darkness, cutting your way into corpse-filled submarines. You can be nightmarish without being, too revolting. Do you know what I mean?
I get it. I get it.
Anyway, so that's a personal project that I'm laboring on.
Excited. That's really cool because, I mean, have you seen the most recent Mission Impossible?
Yes. Well, exactly. That second act in the, I mean, that's a big, World War One, submarines and untersea boats, U-boats were much, much smaller than the kind of nuclear sub that, you're dealing with much more confined and cramped and primitive spaces.
Yeah.
But that claustrophobic feel that they did so brilliantly in Mission Impossible. I looked when we were watching, we went and saw it in IMAX and all big and loud, and it was great. Or the second 2 hours were great. The first hour is like, come on, guys.
I agree. I agree with that. Yeah.
I got to the sub and then into the wahoo in the airplanes. It was all groovy. But I looked over at my 27-year-old daughter who was watching the film in the submarine set, and she had sort of compressed herself into her seat, because she was so tense and anxious with everything. She was like almost in a little fetal crouch in her chair. So I thought, oh yeah, that's working. That's working really well. So yes, it's got that same kind of nightmare, being stuck somewhere that could kill you at any point, for any number of.
In so many different ways too, right? There's so many possible ways you can get tired.
Very ways. And it sort of follows on from my short film, Middle Watch.
I was gonna say that, yeah.
So,
no, that's cool because.
No, it literally followed on from that. I mean, Middle Watch I'd started before the pandemic, but we made it primarily during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And one of the other things, while we were trying to not lose our minds during the pandemic, my wife saw either an interview or a masterclass with Werner Herzog. And I'm paraphrasing this, but somebody had asked him, this sort of terrible question that people get asked, like, where do you get your ideas from? And there's no good answer for that. I don't know what subconscious ideas are getting. But Werner Herzog, being Werner Herzog, had a very specific answer. And he said something like, I listen to Beethoven for 2 hours and I write what comes into my head. My wife Carol said, we should try that. And so we started, I downloaded, the 9 symphonies, and we started, in the afternoons, Carol and I would sit on the couch with a notepad and put on Symphony No. 1 and just spend 2 hours listening to Beethoven and just write whatever came into our heads. And from that, I had an idea about Raptures of the Deep came to me. And from my research into Raptures of the Deep, that led me to eventually down the rabbit hole of discovering the story about this secret diving unit, because the leader of the commander of that unit was a diver who had experienced Raptures of the Deep and had been in, had kind of held the record for deep sea diving at that time, and had created the decompression tables, which were all mathematical. They weren't, had figured them out. So because of that, I abandoned the original Raptures of the Deep idea and started following.
Went for this one, yeah. It's incredible. I always find music and nature are two of the sources, at least for me. I'm sure there are more, that generate some of the most craziest ideas. For me, it always has been nature more than music. But I completely agree with you that it's these things come out of nowhere sometimes. And like the project that I'm working on right now, I wasn't even remotely thinking to touch that subject. And one day it was just out of some frustration, I had a little idea and it just sparked into something a lot bigger, right? It's just one of those things.
You never know, but the Beethoven thing, and I think it is specifically Beethoven. I mean, other people may be able to do it with other music, but I once we started listening to Beethoven that way, I totally understood why Werner Herzog said, it brings things up. There's something in the construction of the music, and I am not musical at all. I can't play an instrument. I don't know anything about it. But if you listen, if you immerse yourself, and do really sort of that kind of trance-like listening to Beethoven, there is weird things that happen to your subconscious. There's stuff going on in the music that actually did trigger things, bubbled ideas up that they weren't fully formed, but they were an idea that you could then take and develop. And that story came. It wasn't directly from that, but something about some of the rhythms or underlying structure of the piece made me think of underwater. I mean, I'm attracted to that anyway, so that's not obviously who watches a nautical tale. I've always liked things to do with the sea, so it's in my DNA anyway.
Yeah, 100%.
That's what bubbled up, and then from that, little first, shoot of an idea, the research into that led me to some other place, and then that was a very deep rabbit hole trying to do historical research on that idea that finally led to getting Northern Ireland Screen involved, who paid for the script, which is fantastic. I hired a naval historian to help me try and get the facts, because the facts were all over the place. And so I did a lot of fact checking of my writing to make sure I wasn't putting events in the wrong order, and that was a big idea. And now we're into how do we get this thing made? We get $5 million so we can make a hand animated World War One naval adventure story.
Well, I'd be really thrilled to see it because it sounds very exciting and concept is unique, and I can already envision in my head how it sort of unfolds from an animation standpoint and the tightness of the environment and everything. So I wish you all the best on that. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk about Madagascar and Tortoise versus Hare and your next project.
Well, hopefully, we don't know. But as soon as when I get the teaser fully animated, I mean, the actual line animation is done. We're now working on backgrounds right now, so I'm hopeful that maybe by the end of the year we'll have everything done. When it's fully done, I'll send you.
Sure, sounds exciting. Awesome. Thank you so much, John. Appreciate it, man.
Okay, take care.
All right, take care, buddy.